Charlie has a very interesting idea. So I want you to buckle on your brain helmet this morning and get ready to listen to something that's going to sound a little different than what you're used to, but might radically change how much you love Easter. Have I oversold it, Charlie?
Um, Perhaps.
Well, I'll tell you,
It has been
ever since you and I started talking about this, I have been like jonesing for Easter.
no. It is definitely like what we're going to talk about has definitely shifted the way I think, not just about Easter, but about the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, however we want to call it, the mission, like the mission of God itself. So it has shifted a lot for me,
Mm,
but not, I wouldn't say radically.
okay.
Uh, it's a minor shift that has long-lasting repercussions, and the longer it goes, the greater the greater the impact, I would say.
Good. You all will notice in this conversation, Charlie is much more careful with words than I am.
This is true. This is very true.
Where do you want to start? Do we start in the Hebrew Testament? Do we start at the beginning of time? Do we start at the end of all things? What do we do?
I think we start at the beginning.
Go.
So, uh, over time, I've come to see um, that creation, God, in the act of creating, his mission is to create and sustain a thriving life.
Mm,
Um, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that Christ says that He comes to bring is an abundant life
yeah.
for all creation, and that got me thinking. It's like, okay, so God God's goal for creation is an abundant life rooted in love and relationships, um, between all of creation and God, all of creation and the rest of creation, each individual piece of creation within itself. And it's like, okay, so if God's goal, if the metric that God uses to say how well is creation doing is life, then what does that make death? Not just dying, but like this idea of death that keeps on reoccurring, particularly in the Old Testament, but it comes up in the New Testament quite a bit, where death is this personification of all that is antagonistic towards life. Um, and I think Isaiah has some of the most profound uh, personifications, embodiments of this idea of death as being all that has gone wrong in the world, oppression, injustice. It's the cooperation with the rulers of Israel and Judah with death is what brings the destruction, according to Isaiah. Um, Death is the curse that is on the land, not because God has cursed it, but because of our own cooperation with taking life away,
Mm,
with restricting access to life, um, by either through marginalization, through economic injustice, through however you want to frame it. Um, Death is simply that which takes life away, which restricts life. Dying, of course, is like the greatest act of death. When we die, when those we love die, we're cut off from them in a way.
mm,
Um, and I think that is the starting point for looking at what the resurrection could mean. What does it mean that death is swallowed up? Earlier in Corinthians 15, Paul gives a rather brief list of the enemies of God, and these are the rulers and powers and authorities that have to be subjugated before the full resurrection of the church, let's say. But then he says, and the final enemy to be defeated is death. So death supersedes these other things, all these other adversaries of God, of life, are rooted in death. Death is the thing that then gives them power, let's say. So, yeah, I don't know. Do you want to jump in here and
Well, yeah, that was
a bit? Like I can go on and on for hours on this if you want, but I don't think we have time for that.
well, no, but we can definitely flesh it out more in our conversation. But the two aspects of it that really impacted me for this morning is this idea that so many of the bad things we see in the world are the fruit of the root.
Yeah.
And I always distinguish between the root and the fruit. And the death is the root. It is that which is the anchor for all of these other manifestations of injustice and harm and so many other evils. But this thing you talked about with the personification of death, it starts to make sense when you look at scriptures related to this, that death is the enemy of life and God's enemy is death.
Yeah.
And so in Easter, we see that life conquers death.
Yeah, we see that. And what I think is the most profound thing with Easter is that it's God's no to the power of death, of saying death does not have the final say, but it's also a yes, a divine yes to what Jesus brought to that life, and saying this is what it is. This is what life is.
Yes.
Is Christ. And I think that's where the hope is for us. Yeah. It's not necessarily a hope of one day we will be brought back from the dead, but that life is here and now. We have to grab hold of it. We have to embody it and make it real. Walter Brueggemann, he's an amazing Old Testament scholar, has a book called Prophetic Imagination. And one of his theses in that book is the prophets with God make an argument to the world that what is real is rooted in what is possible. And that is antithetical to what the world would argue, which is what is possible is only rooted in reality, what we see and what we can do here and now. We have to expand our imagination for how life can be abundant for everyone.
Yeah.
And that's the hope, is that we get to partner with God and do this work. That's the good news of the kingdom of heaven, is we are participants in life with God and making this thing fleshed out, incarnate here.
That when we, through our actions and intentions, partner with this death and its fruit, its antecedents, we close down the possibilities for human flourishing and prosperity for all creation.
Yeah.
When we partner with life, which we'll call God's coming kingdom, we open up possibilities of human flourishing and prosperity for all creation.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It is
and you can see that argument, just to try to give credence that, like, I'm just not making these things up off the top of my head. If you read like Romans 5-8 with the idea of sin and death as personifications rather than like sin as things we do and dying as something that happens, you see that sin and death wield power over, are things that we participate in and rule over. It's so much more than, sin is a bad thing that we do. Sin is the things that we participate in that cut off the possibility for flourishing. And because of Christ, we have a way for life to flourish. We have the road that has been walked ahead, that our job is to follow behind. The resurrection is Christ has gone ahead and shown that death is defeated.
Yeah.
It still holds power, but it is defeated now.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I always think of is I read a book one time about if you ever see woodpeckers banging on a tree, um, that tree has a very limited time left standing up
Yeah.
because the bugs are already on the inside. That's what the woodpeckers are after.
Mhm.
And in a sense, that's what I would think of resurrection is the skirting of death. And it still is upright and it still manifests in the world, but it is a time limited proposal because life has circled death.
No, that's so beautiful. That's that is so beautiful. It's and Easter and Good Friday, like they hold so much for me
Mm,
because the crucifixion for me, I see not as an atonement of like making something right between us and God, but as an act of solidarity of the divine with those who suffer,
mm,
of experiencing the full weight of what death can throw at us. And the resurrection is saying, even if you suffer to this extent, even if you experience the worst the world and death can throw at you, life wins in the end.
mm.
And that's why Easter is so beautiful. That's why the resurrection for me is so much hope.
Man, what a great note to end on.